In this video, we're going to look at a Python-Flask app that is going to render some web pages, and one of them is going to, in one situation, we're going to pass some data, and then that data is going to be sort of processed and rendered using Jinja. So first of all, here are some of the files. There are files inside the template. 1 and 2 came from a previous example, so they already exist over in my virtual environment, but I'm just going to sort of overwrite them. And then flyers, py and flyers.json. This is old flyers data for people who care about such things. I'm going to copy all this. So I'm going to copy it sort of with the folder structure, with the templates folder. Copy that and then go over to documents, Flask Demos, virtual environment, and then paste that in here. And to the 1 and 2.html that were in templates, those were already in the templates folder, and I can either replace them or skip them either way because they're pretty much the same file. So I'll do a replace. That's just a way then I can take some files I have someplace else and put them into a virtual environment I already have set up. But the folder structure, especially if we're going to use a render template, that having files specifically in that templates folder is important. And there are going to be other folders with important purposes as we go on later, but right now we just have templates. Okay, so pasted that over. And now I'm interested in the flyers py, and again, we sort of built up. We had hello world, which just wrote pure text, and then we had to one route. Then we had two routes, and we are writing HTML from Python. And then we used a template, and we were using the render template method to go to two sort of static hard-coded pages. And now we're going to pass some information to a third page about the flyers and see how to sort of process that passed data. Okay. So here we go. First, I just, again, have this long comment with the reminders. Let's get that virtual environment. Let's move into it. So down here on the terminal, cd, v, and v. To move into the right folder, then I'm going to do scripts. I'm in a Windows system, bin in sort of Mac or Linux, and activate. So now I'm in an activated virtual environment, and then I'm going to specify that I have now up to 4 apps in this virtual environment. I'm specifying that it's the flyers one I'm interested in. I'm going to allow for debugging. And I'm going to do a Flask run. And I have some printing of the data I read in. So this is some flyers data sort of popped out to the terminal. But here is the URL, control click. And I have a default route as I did before. And I have a one route as I had before. The default route and the one route are effectively lead to the same page. I have a route 2, which leads to a different page. Those were both static pages, so they were just pure HTML typed out, doesn't change unless you go over here to the templates folder and change it. And then finally, the new part is this flyers route. And we'll see that all of this data about the flyers roster from, I don't know, 3 years ago, is written out in what's called Jinja. Okay, so that's what we've made. Those were my comments to help get me started. Okay, we are importing Flask and render template. We've seen this before. We're starting a Flask app. We've seen this before. We are reading a JSON file. Now there's a better place to put the JSON file. So right now we're going to work with, render template, and that is a special place where we put HTML files. And there can be a special place where we can put like data files. But we haven't introduced that yet. So we're just going to work sort of more in a pure, rather than in a Flask way, where Flask will sort of designate a special place for data. Right now, we're working more on just the pure Python side. And so we're just going to put a JSON file next to the Python. So we'll do better in the future. But for now, I'm putting the flyers.json file next to my flyers.python file. So nothing fancy there. And so I'm using the import JSON because I'm going to read JSON. I'm using the operating system, and this could be handled by Flask, but I'm not having it handled by Flask. I'm handling it in Python. So I brought in the operating system, and I'm just setting up that in underscore underscore file, that is this file, flyers.py. I'm finding its path. I'm getting the directory name from the path, and I'm setting the directory to that path. So I'm sort of putting myself sort of operationally in the right location, just to be sure that the terminal understands where it is. I moved to the terminal myself, but I don't want to necessarily have to do that. Here I am reading the JSON file and getting the data out of it, and then using the JSON class to sort of parse that information as JSON. And this is, if we look at the JSON, it is, if I were talking about JSON language, it's an array of objects. If I'm talking about sort of in Python language, I will call it a list of dictionaries. But that's what we're getting out of the JSON file. So that's what flyers is. So flyers is definitely Python. So I should talk about it as a list of dictionaries. And in 37, we just printed it out so we can see that all down here. And now here we are establishing the routes. Here's the default route and the one route, and they're both being handled by the template, the one.html that's in the templates folder. And that's just some static HTML. The to route is handled by the to.html, and again, just static HTML. Now here's the one that's different. This new route, the flyers route, handling that by a function I'm calling flyer. And we are using render template again, but now this time we have a second argument, and we are sending it the flyers data. And this sort of ends up sort of renaming it. So in Python right here, so far, it is called flyers. There it is, flyers in 36. But the past information, the information that I'm going to be passing, I'm going to be calling players. And I could give it the same name. I can give it a different name. That hardly matters. And then down here, just if I were not running the command line, not running my app by command line, then this would put me in some kind of debugging mode. Okay. So now we've seen one before. If you've seen the previous video, and we've seen two before, it's flyers.html. That's different. And we need to see how are we handling this past information, and that's going to be using this Jinja. Okay. So here is flyers HTML. Just some basic head, a title, some meta tags, nothing interesting there. The body, some headers. And then finally down here, starting at 14, this is us working with the Jinja, with the past information. So again, players is what was passed. Over in Python, it was called flyers, but in the passing, we ended up sort of renaming it as players. So players, depending on what language you want to use, might be an array of objects, or a list of dictionaries. Again, let's remind you what the JSON looked like. So there were these square brackets and then these curly brackets, and then there was a bunch of those. So that's what we got out of the JSON. And that got passed as under the name players over to the Flyers HTML. And then in Flyers HTML, we have this thing, this list or array, depending on what language you're using. And that has come over when the template was called. When Flyers was called, this information was passed. Okay. We're using Jinja, so these curly percents and curly curlies, they belong here to Jinja. And you usually use curly percent when you're doing some kind of control structure, and curly curly when you want the data. So players is the array or list, and then player is a sort of a dummy name for a given iteration. So, and then we have to look at the JSON and see what properties we have. We have properties like ID, player, number, position, and so that's what I'm displaying here. I'm saying I want a header, I want a division, I want another division, I want a break, and these, and I'm getting these properties: the player's number, the player, which I think was the name, the player height, the player weight, the player birthplace. So that's what I'm spitting out over here. So the number and the name, that was in a head H4, so that's why that ended up in bold, because that's a standard way to format a header 4. And then we wanted the height and the weight, and the header 4 had some space before and after, or at least certainly after. Player height and width. So there, this guy was 5'11" and 187, and the birthplace was someplace in Canada. And then I had a break, and I'm looping. So then I get the next player. The next player, these are all players. This guy moved to, I don't know, the Capitals or something. So that's what I wanted to show you. That's the one thing that's different in this version versus the previous video was the passing of the information. The information was a Python language, a list of dictionaries. Then we can use Jinja in the file, in the HTML file, in the template. We can use Jinja, and it has ways to control. So we're doing a for loop, as sort of a control structure, and we can access the data. That's the curly curly. And player was a dictionary or an object from this list or array, and these were the properties. So that's what I wanted to show you. Thanks for your attention.